Hello everyone and welcome to the latest MDPI webinar on the Journal of Clinical Medicine entitled The Future of Translational Medicine. This webinar is co-organised by Academia Europaea, the Academy of Europe. This webinar is chaired by Professor Ole Petersen, who is Professor of Physiology in the School of Biosciences at Cardiff University, UK. As one of the world's prominent physiologists, he leads a research group on disease of the pancreas. Petersen was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 2000, member of the German National Academy of Sciences Leopoldina in 2010, and gave the Leopoldina Lecture in 2012. He received the Nordic Insulin Foundation's Jacobaeus Prize, the Czech Academy of Sciences Purkyně Medal, and was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2008 for services to science. In 2017, he was elected Honorary Member of the German Society for Gastroenterology, Digestive and Metabolic Diseases. More recently, he received the American Physiological Society's Walter B. Cannon Memorial Award. Petersen will be presented with the Gold Medal of the Academia Europaea for his contribution to the development of the European science. Professor Petersen is Vice President of the Academia Europaea and Director of the AE Cardiff Knowledge Hub. He has been appointed Chief Editor of American Physiological Society's open access flagship journal, Function, which was launched earlier this year. Before the webinar officially starts, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is recorded and the recording will be made available as soon as possible and will be posted on the webinar's webpage, as well as on the Cardiff Hub website. Today, there will be 3 presentations given by Professor Peter Hedgie, Professor Ole Petersen, and Professor Stephen Holgate. This will be followed by a discussion in the Q&A session moderated by Professor Petersen. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box. And now I hand over the floor to Professor Petersen. I hope you enjoy this webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlotte. It's a pleasure to be able to start this webinar on translational medicine. We have 2 outstanding speakers with us today. The first talk will be given by Professor Peter Hedgie, who is Director of the Center for Translational Medicine at the University of Page. Peter is an elected member of Academia Europaea and the Deputy Chair of the Academy's Section for Clinical Science. He's a prominent pancreatologist, both on the basic science side and on the clinical side. So we are delighted to have him here, and he will in a moment start by basically giving an overview of this translational medicine project. Stephen Holgate will give the last talk on delivering personalized medicine for patient benefit. Professor Stephen Holgate is a very prominent, both actually basic scientist and clinician scientist, who is an MRC clinical research professor at the University of Southampton. He is a commander of the Order of the British Empire, fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a prominent European personality in the field of clinical medicine. So we are delighted to have Stephen with us today. And I think without any further ado, because we have limited time, I would like to give the floor to Peter Hedgie, who will give us the overview of the TM cycle. So please, Peter.
Dear Ole, dear all participants, organizer, it's really a great pleasure to speak about a very important project of Academia of Europaea, the Translational Medicine Project. And within almost 1.5 years, the team put together a new model, a new thinking about translational medicine, about the translational medicine cycle. So if we look at all our life, science and technology drive everything. So even if we go by car somewhere and using GPS and all other issues in every daily life, science is with us. If we look at medicine, it's exactly the same. In the past, mainly the doctor's experience helped us to treat the patients. However, due to the huge amount of scientific activity, presently mostly the evidence-based medicine which drives the basic clinical practice. However, and you will see also in later presentations today, that we are going to the future of medicine, which is definitely will be the personalized medicine. If we ask the questions, whether do we use our scientific knowledge well enough? Are we good at translating scientific knowledge back for population benefits? Unfortunately, the answers must be no. And why do we say that we don't use all efforts for patients' benefit? If we look at the EU data, and people under 75, 1.7 million persons die annually. And from that, 1.2 million would be avoidable with better medicine, because most of them would be either treatable or preventable. If we look at almost in every countries, this life could be between 60 and 80%. Therefore, it's almost needless to say that new model for translating scientific knowledge back to the population benefits is needed. If you look at the scientific activity, it's tremendously grown in the last 50, 70 years. Last year, 1.4 million publications were published. And if you look at the benefits for the patients, it's really not good enough. And we need somehow to take this knowledge back for the patients. Therefore, it's almost needless to say that the bench to the bedside model of translational medicine needs to be somehow rethought and re-challenged, and we need to put together a new model for translational medicine. So not surprisingly, the Academy of Europea in 2018 thought that a project on translational medicine would be crucially important. And we were very proud that the Academy chose our center to be one of the key organizers of this new model. And not only members of the Academy of Europea, but really top experts from US and several top journals, chief editors like Nature Medicine, joined us together to plan a really new model of translational medicine. And what is this model about? We all know that the starting question is always at the bedside, at healthcare, so we need to raise the question, and if we don't have the answer, we need to do a huge amount of scientific activities like basic, applied, and clinical science level. However, just only publishing these kind of scientific discoveries alone will not let the whole circle close. So we need to organize our knowledge, such as knowledge publications, and very importantly, we need to communicate our data either to protocol development or to politicians, policymakers, and patients as well. Of course, all models needs to be proved that this is a good model. And actually in Hungary at the University of Pécs, we must say that we could somehow overcome the difficulties of applying a new model. So we tested this model from 1st of January 2016. So we looked at how we can close the whole cycle. First, we established an interdisciplinary unit, which is really very important concerning the research support for clinicians and scientists. It's important to say that the very busy clinicians don't have the right time for all methodologies to know, and also the same basic scientists also need like core facilities which support the data. So therefore, including biostatisticians, informatics, lawyers, communication managers, we put together a research support team. And concerning healthcare, we could reach a better healthcare using the whole system. First of all, besides the general module of the evidence consultants. We could have data coordinators, data managers, and PhD students in all over our unit. And we use the evidence-based medicine at our departments, and we try to organize as many as clinical trials and registries as well. Within a very short period of time, within this system, we could publish articles and we could come back directly for patients' benefit. For example, one of the model, we collected data from 10,000 patients from 23 countries. And due to the data analysis, we could find out what kind of biomarker this leads doctors concerning antibiotic prescription for patients suffering in acute pancreatitis. And due to this data analysis, we could decrease the antibiotics with 50%. Also, the early enteral feeding in acute pancreatitis reduced with 2/3 the mortality level in severe pancreatitis. And of course, if you have a better healthcare, it's better for the economy. So altogether, we could decrease the patient's care cost with 25%. So having scientific activity next to the healthcare system definitely make benefits for the patients and also the economy as well. Of course, scientific activity, especially university levels, are a key issue. When we started this model, our unit published around 6-7 articles annually. Last year, using this cycle method, we could publish 68 really good quality papers, and the average of the impact was 4.5, which shows the excellence, and also it includes several high impact papers as well. It's also must say that the whole research activity needs to be diverse. So 1/3 of our activities were basic science, 1/3 different clinical scientific models, and 1/3 just reanalyzing the already collected data, like in network meta-analysis or meta-analysis. Of course, it's not enough, because as I said at the beginning, just publishing the articles will not bring the knowledge back for patients' benefit. So we need to summarize our activities in different guidelines. And using this model, the Hungarian Pancreatic Study Group could show high research activities. Therefore, we became to be one of the leaders of the guidelines. And on the other hand, communicating back to our knowledge is important for healthcare professionals, patients, and also policymakers. For example, we always make in our presentations the statement that acute pancreatitis, we don't have any kind of drugs to treat it, or we don't have any kind of drugs to prevent the recurrence of acute pancreatitis. However, it's also very well known and published in a randomized clinical trial that having patients' education can decrease the rate of recurrence with 2/3, which shows that educating patients is crucially important if you would like to have a better healthcare. Also, it's important to educate doctors, and unfortunately, currently, in most of the university curriculum, the basics of the different clinical trial methodologies are not existed, and also how to critically evaluate the different evidences, how to implicate it in a clinical practice is not in the curriculum. So we started a new kind of education also for postgraduate students. However, in plenty of times, you need to educate the policymakers. Especially, I brought to you an example from recently. All know that the pandemic of coronavirus is a big challenge in all over the world. So our center immediately established a coronavirus study group doing a huge amount of clinical science activities. And due to this activity, we analyzed regional differences, also epidemiology parts, and suggested actually in materials, translated this for politicians' language, So we try to identify the problems and we suggested solutions for the politicians to choose. And of course, we communicated it to the National Epidemiological Policy Making Body, and actually which was directly led by the Prime Minister and Ministries of Healthcare. And we were really happy to see that translating this kind of scientific knowledge for policymakers also helped Hungary to handle the crisis very well in the system. So we must say at Academia of Europea that this kind of circle, all elements of the circle are crucially important to translate our knowledge for population's benefits. And we were really happy to lead this project through the Academia of Europea, and we were very happy to see the final publication of the manuscript. But of course, not only this model, but plenty of things in basic and clinical sciences needs to be discussed. And I think the future presentations today will bring you through all the scientific activities as well. So thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I will be more than happy to have questions and answers.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for this very clear working through what was a very extensive report indeed. So we'll come back to that undoubtedly. Many important points you made in the discussion period. So I will delve into some more philosophical points about why many discoveries in basic science do not always progress either to community benefit or more specifically to patient care. And there are many reasons for that, and I've listed some of them on the second slides. There are more reasons, but these are probably some of the more prominent ones. Quite often, a particular piece of basic research brings up some very interesting findings, but is not sufficiently developed for translation. And because of the lack of basic science funding in most countries, then it often happens that things are not followed up. Basic scientists make a grant application, it's not given high enough priority for funding in spite of good reviews, and that's very often then the end of that matter. I think it's a very, very frequent reason. Another reason is the difficulties of communication between basic scientists and clinicians. It's not easy, and in many cases there is less communication than there should be, in spite of very many good efforts to bring things together. But basic scientists often do not sufficiently understand a clinical perspective, and equally many clinical scientists find it difficult to understand the basic science, and it requires a lot of effort to have this communication going on. Then there are the cases where a strong basic science case has been properly brought out in such a way that it can actually be useful. But then there are many kind of challenges on the clinical side. Clinical trials are very expensive. Clinical trials have to conform to a very specific set of conditions. And it may be that a clinical trial does not give the expected result. In some cases, that may then be a perfectly rational decision to say, no, it's not going to work, so we're not going to take it further. However, it is also perfectly possible that a particular set of conditions, let's say for a particular drug, particular dose, particular timing, has not worked out, and maybe a different dose, a different timing, a different type of intervention would have worked. So sometimes there is a phase where something is deemed as useless at too early in stage, and then nothing further happens. And finally, we have to admit that there are cases where basic science results turn out to be wrong for one or another reason, and I will come back to that again. And the same, of course, also applies to clinical science, which is not always getting everything right. Next slide, please. Now, I will utilize here very briefly some results of another working group that I was involved with. And that's the so-called SAPEA project, Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. 5 pan-European organizations are participating in this, funded by the European Commission. And Academia Europaea is one of these 5 organizations. And the project was making sense of science under conditions of uncertainty and complexity. And it was led by Ortwin Wren, who is seen with the beard at the back of the photo, sitting next to me at a working group meeting in Berlin. Now, it turned out that when I reread this report recently again, I realized that although making sense of science was in the context of how policy advisors could use it, it actually, a lot of the things that were said in that report are very important basic consideration also for the translation of science into medical benefits. Next slide, please. So there are some very fundamental philosophical points which I think are sometimes forgotten, and it's worth just having a quick look at them. So results of scientific studies are not direct representations of objective truths, but nor are they arbitrary. And we have to understand that science is a systematic search for evidence under agreed upon rules of inquiry, and has to be done with a certain methodological rigor, which depends on the particular subject areas. And very importantly, requires continuous review and debate. And even then, we have to understand that even if you have very extensive evidence, it still may not be conclusive because of uncertainties, ambiguities, and limits of understanding. And there are some illusions which are shared sometimes both by basic scientists and clinical scientists, illusions of certainty, transferability, absolute truth, ubiquitous applicability, which one has to sort of take into account. Next slide, please. So the uncertainties which are inherent in all, both basic science and indeed clinical science as well, of course, are of different orders. There are the technical problems, there are the methodological problems, there are the more philosophical epistemological problems, namely that there simply is a limited theoretical understanding, which means that even a well-conducted investigation may actually not be meaningful. Next slide, please. And this, I think, is very important. And I think it is actually something that every basic scientist and clinical scientist could read with benefits every day of their life to remind themselves of some of the really important points. And it applies to clinical science as much as to basic science. And what this report emphasizes so much is that the virtues that are necessary for good science are also the classical ethical virtues. As I think it is probably Ortwin Wren who wrote this paragraph, to show integrity is to be a person of integrity. To be open and honest in writing results is to be an honest person. To be alert to your own errors is to put aside arrogance as a character trait which is quite widely distributed both amongst basic and clinical scientists. So the values and the virtues necessary for good science, and therefore also for translation of good science, are not distinct from some of the ethical virtues and values we employed in general in society. Next slide, please. So let's just look at a particular example. Peter already came onto the topic of COVID-19, which of course is uppermost in everyone's mind at the moment. So has basic science helped there very much? And probably the answer is not all that much so far. And this is very much from the perspective of a cellular physiologist. And there are many other aspects of basic science that I could put out, but I just have this as an example because I know about this. And so to the right, you see the basic scheme of how corona and other Ebola viruses get into cells. It's a relatively simple scheme, which has been clearly worked out. These steps are absolutely vital. For example, the proton pump that pumps protons into endosomes is absolutely vital. If you block that pump, there's no virus entry whatsoever to the cell, totally blocked. Equally, the calcium release via 2-port channels is essential because the uptake of protons and release of calcium are linked. And if one of them doesn't work, the other one also doesn't work. And again, the virus will not get into the cells. So this has been known for corona and Ebola viruses for 5 years. But for all this kind of reasons, maybe that I discussed before, it hasn't really led to any specific interventions that are useful. We now know that SARS-CoV-2 operates exactly in the same way, which is not a great surprise, actually. And maybe now there will be more interest in developing this. And this leads me to my very final points before I stop. And that's a wider issue. We have to remember that what is important for patient care and for treatment in the community, etc., is not only what we think of perhaps as strict peer-reviewed scientific evidence. There is also a lot of kind of knowledge that has been accumulated that has not actually been provided in that particular way, and which has not always been used actually in this crisis. Next slide, please. And one important point is the question of how science advice is mixed in with governmental decisions. And independence of scientific advice is actually very, very important, as this paragraph, again from the Making Sense of Science reports, makes very clear. And we have seen in many countries, maybe particularly in the UK and the US, a certain intermixing, probably too much for what has been good in general, between science advisors and government, and there has been less independence, also from the Royal Society, which actually has foundational interest in this matter, but has not had a very clear independent scientific profile giving advice in this particular crisis. In contrast, a country that has done much, much, much better in the COVID-19 case, namely Germany, next slide please, has had a national academy that actually has taken a very active role and right from the beginning has issued report after report, quite detailed, giving advice in the public domain that was independent of government and nevertheless has to some extent also driven government policy. So I think that's another very important lesson from this epidemic. It goes to some extent to the very heart actually of what is also necessary for translational medicine. So I'll stop there and give the word to Professor Stephen Holgate.
Thank you very much, Ole. I'll just put my slides up. Is that okay?
Yep.
Good, thank you. Well, thank you again for inviting me to participate in this most important discussion, especially at this time when we're obviously dealing with the world problem of COVID-19, and I think no better time to have this discussion than is now. I'm going to talk about some of the uses of translational medicine and why it is so urgently important that we embed within our health systems the ability to be able to use high science to target with great precision the treatment of many complex and difficult diseases. And I've called it stratified medicine. Now, stratified medicine is, of course, taking a complex disease and trying to understand what are the drivers within that complexity that leads to the heterogeneity of disease expression. And obviously, the things feeding into that relate to populations, relate to different biological processes, and even relate to underlying genetics. This is why the area of stratified medicine has been given different names at different times. I prefer stratified because it makes no assumptions about causal mechanisms at this stage. But precision medicine or P4 or personalized medicine are terms that have also been used. In essence, it boils down to what Peter was saying a few moments ago, that it is identifying targets within the human disease process so the right patient receives the right therapy at the right time. So stratification can be used to improve mechanistic understanding of disease processes and therefore identify new disease targets for directing treatments. It may be used to develop biomarkers for disease risk, diagnosis, prognosis, and the response to treatment. And it allows treatments to be developed, tested, and applied to the most appropriate patient groups. In other words, one size does not fit all. As an example of this, and one of the earliest examples, I'm going to use cancer because they really have led the stratified or personalized medicine charge over the last decade. Now, when I was trained as a young doctor, when one was managing a disease like cancer, one relied really on the descriptive symptomatic presentation, one relied on limited investigations, and one relied on the histopathology of the tumor. Mixing those together with an experienced clinician or oncologist led to the treatment decision. In this case, differentiating squamous from non-squamous cell carcinoma would be the decision that would be made as to what treatment a patient would have. And therefore, it was the oncologist who made that treatment. But in understanding the biology behind these cancers, we now know that there are different cell and molecular mechanisms involved, and in each patient will have a different combination of some of these. And shown at the bottom on the right-hand side, you'll see a number of molecular targets in a cancerous cell that have become now therapeutic targets. And combinations of these give rise to different tumors in different people. This leads to much more complex decision-making, where the stakeholders extend beyond the oncologist to involve surgeons, pathologists, and various other laboratory technicians and technologists. Education, as Peter also mentioned, is important here so that molecular understanding of a disease where a diagnostic test can be used can then be applied to treatment decisions. This is, as illustrated in cancer, not a simple issue of a single drug and a single diagnostic test, but identifying which abnormalities are active in a particular patient and targeting these either alone, as sometimes can be the case, or in combination. So I've illustrated the whole idea of a complex disease here as a salami sausage. And what we're trying to do is slice the sausage in intelligent ways and making sure that the complexity of the disease can be mapped onto those particular slices. And this is really what underpins patient heterogeneity and the heterogeneity in responses to various treatments. As we move to the top right of this slide, you'll see that in cancer, a whole range of individual molecular targets have now been identified, which can be used to pick off individual abnormalities within a tumor cell. And what's interesting here is that a brain tumor may share 2 or 3 of these pathways with a lung cancer or with ovarian cancer. In other words, we're now breaking down the barriers between organ-based cancers and the different molecular pathways that may be involved. And these can be identified either through genetic, biochemical, imaging, clinical scores, behavioral, psychological behaviors, and other variables. So there is no one-size-fits-all in stratified medicine. This is a great example, the National Lung Matrix trial. This is a £25 million trial aborted a few years ago by Cancer Research UK, involving 3 pharmaceutical companies and a range of universities across the UK. It identified a number of molecular targets in lung cancer, and as you can see, the targets are involved in these different pathways, and then 8 drugs were being used to target these pathways generated by the different companies cooperating together in 18 molecular cohorts. And this really is stratified medicine at its best, where people are coming together around a complex problem and using molecular approaches to dissect the complexity of the disease. This is my own disease area, bronchial asthma. It's a disease of the epithelium where environmental factors, shown at the top, interface with the epithelium and stimulate an abnormal immunological response. And although at one time all asthma was treated the same and the only thing that changed was the concentration or frequency of a drug that was given, such as corticosteroids. Now we know that there are different subtypes of asthma. Shown here are two main ones, the Th2 asthma, which is the classical allergic asthma, and the ILC2 asthma, which is the non-allergic type of asthma. And you'll see the availability of monoclonal antibodies, which are extremely precise at interfering with molecular pathways, can be used to pick off very, very effectively the various pathways involved in each of those processes. And now even going upscale towards the origins of some of these diseases, antibodies are being generated that interfere with the first reading of the environment into the asthma process, such as the anti-TSLP. And even in a disease like schizophrenia, which we thought was a single disease entity at one time, characterized by abnormal dopaminergic functions, we now know that there are different subtypes, some involving serotonin, other involving elevated norepinephrine, and the other involving the GABA pathway. And by using combinations of antagonists and inhibitors, one can achieve a far, far better therapeutic response. And the reason that this can be done now is that brain imaging, functional brain imaging, allows for these different stratification to be made. So as I close, I want to draw your attention to an article that we wrote a year or two ago called Methodology in Stratified Medicine, which lays all this out under the Medical Research Council. We had several workshops involving a large number of people that came to some interesting conclusion. And you can gain access to this methodological stratified medicine document on this website. It presents a pathway for stratified medicine research. It identifies the critical questions that need to be asked. It describes the pitfalls and sources of bias. It describes the different methodological approaches to inform study design and enables investigators working in different phases of stratified medicine to integrate their work in a truly interdisciplinary way. So we start off with getting the question right. What is the problem? Framing the question. And then we move into the stratum discovery, whether it be genetic, using imaging, whatever technology it is. So we have to design that experiment properly, conduct it in a spectrum of patients, analyze the data critically, and then importantly, interpret the findings. And there's an interrelationship between each of these things as the biomarker starts to emerge. Once it has emerged from whatever source, whether genetic, a protein, a scanning technique, whatever, it needs to be validated. And this is the verification. And this is absolutely crucial in this journey of stratified medicine. And again, you need to develop in an independent population the ability of the biomarker to be reproduced entirely as it was in the original study, so that it can be reevaluated in an objective manner and inserted into the final stage, which is the use of this in the clinical paradigm. In other words, taking the biomarker, turning it into a diagnostic test, and then hopefully using that to target treatment. So these interesting stratified approaches to complex diseases are happening right across human medicine now, involving chronic inflammatory disease, degenerative diseases, inflammatory diseases, including COVID-19, I should add, so that it is shaping how we diagnose patients, how we treat patients, and targeting that treatment to those that are best going to benefit from them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for this very elegant exposition, which I think has been extremely helpful. We may start with the very first one by Simon Mahmoud Malhi, saying true basic science, lack of funding is there, but additionally, lack of cooperation in professionals is also hindering. How about overcoming this? And well, maybe Peter wants to say something about that.
Yeah, it's really a very good question. Thank you very much for highlighting this problem. Actually, currently, especially in our Eastern European part, but mostly also in UK or other, is where somebody finishing the university mostly going to be in a basic science or going to see patients and do practice. And most of the doctors who are doing practice not involved in either scientific data collection or scientific activity. So I think we need much more physicians understanding science. And of course, it's even better if they also do science. So I think in a 21st century, all physicians should do science at least once a day, and maybe 4 days in practice, 1 day in science. This would be a minimum to follow all the knowledge in science. And if they start, for example, in this day, having a word with the basic scientists, clinical scientists, they could apply the knowledge in medicine much better in the daily activity than today. And of course, financial issues is a big problem. No basic physiology applications, basic molecular biology applications is hardly sponsored because everyone would like to have immediate benefits. So I think basic science definitely needs more support. But to make a bridge between physicians and scientists, I think we need to think about reorganizing a physician's position. What does it mean actually? I don't know, Stefan, for example, what do you think about general physicians, how much they should be at least understanding in science?
Yeah, very good points. I don't know whether Stephen would want to add anything to that.
Yes, Peter, well, I agree with you. And of course, what's happening now is that the barriers between disciplines is breaking down as we start to understand common cell and molecular pathways shared between different diseases. And therefore, therapeutics that can be developed in one disease might be applicable just as well or even better in another disease. So we are undergoing a very revolutionary change in the way medicine is being practiced. And of course, you know, one can't be an expert in everything, but as you say, Peter, I think a basic understanding of the main drivers that support living creatures, the molecular and cellular pathways, is fundamental to understanding these emerging new targets and diagnostic tests used to identify them.
Yeah, I think it is a real challenge because on the one hand, as both Peter and Stephen have said, it's essential, this communication. On the other hand, there are many other drivers that tend to make that very difficult. The specialization, the amount of knowledge that you have to know drives people sort of into their specialties and away from the communication with other people. So there are some intrinsic problems in all of this, and we all, I guess, have to be smarter and be more clever at utilizing our time in the best possible way. But certainly it is a challenging situation. There's a question I see. Sorry, yeah.
And sorry, just one short comment. Inventing knowledge, not only important to daily in medicine, but to invent a new model of self-organization to ourselves is also very important. So I just can suggest the physicians not think about that we have been doing it for 20, 30 years and very well, why should we change? So I think in the 21st century, we need to change our models of daily practice. And I think we must understand that if we don't change the regular basis of our daily activity in medicine as a physician, we will never can use the scientific knowledge better in daily practice.
Yeah, very good point. There's a question from Vangsa Ismail on the back to nature medication. And I wonder, Stephen, whether you might be willing to say something about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting phenomena, isn't it? Because in a way, I use the word medicine, stratified medicine, and maybe the correct terminology should be stratified healthcare. Because if we just take COVID, for example, I mean, one of the things that people have really missed more than anything else if they're living in the big cities is the inability to be able to contact their fellow human beings physically, or even to be able to get out to the countryside or to the sea. And so this mental health impact that COVID-19 has had obviously is much more complex than just being locked in the house and not being able to get away from it. We're missing some vital parts of society because we're all part of an ecosystem and interact with it. And when that ecosystem is broken, as it has been this last 3 months, we miss it and we start to experience adverse effects. I think there is a rising trend now for nutraceutical type medicine, for using nature in an intelligent way. But I would say here that if one is going down this route, what we need is strong evidence that whatever the intervention is shown to work and is free from adverse reactions. I think there is evidence-based medicine coming out of traditional medicine now, which is fantastic. And I've got the great pleasure of knowing several people who are doing wonderful research in this area. And as a result of that, are introducing new treatments. And some of the malaria treatments, for example, have been good examples of that. So yes, there is a balance here, but generally speaking, understanding the cellular and molecular mechanisms of human disease is going to be the most important thing of knowing how best to intervene.
And then there's a question from Ines Saxtina down at the bottom, which I think is also quite important. Again, it relates a little bit to the first question, but this is more specifically geared towards the medical course. And again, I think maybe Peter might have start on that one.
It's a very good point. I also just read it and wanted to make it as a highlight of this point, because actually we need, I think, a new model of education. If we separate for basic theoretical medicine and clinical medicine, I think everyone will be afraid of the basic part of the medicine if we just teach anatomy, biochemistry, physiology all together. And by the time they already forgot what they learned there, we go for the clinical part. I think, for example, an organ-based education could help, for example, on it. If you look at a disease like asthma or pancreatitis, and when you teach the disease, you start with the basics understanding of the pathomechanism and molecular biology of the disease. And after immediately you highlight the importance of this knowledge in the clinical implication could help. In my experience, what I can see, if you separate it to only a basic course and you go through all the mechanisms and you go to the clinical side, the students will mostly choose the clinical sides before they understand the basics. I think an organ-based education or a disease-based education could help on it.
Yeah. So early patient exposure is a very good thing for people training in medicine, but also early patient exposure is very good for people training in cell and molecular biology, because all of us want to do our work in the context of making a difference to humanity in one form or another. So I think creating relevance for a particular direction of education is really, really important. And I think most university courses now involving science do, I think, encourage people to make contact with humanity in order to understand the context within which they're learning their cell and molecular work. And I'd also say that the systems courses that Peter just described, where you learn clinical medicine in the context of cell and molecular biology and vice versa, means that those two things start to associate with each other much more smoothly than having two separate courses running in parallel.
I agree with both Peter and Stephen in all the points that are made, but there are clearly some serious challenges here again, because again, the amount of basic science knowledge has increased enormously. At the same time, also the amount of clinical science has increased enormously. And there are sometimes genuine difficulties in actually giving people the I would say, the basic tools they need in order to be able to work effectively in it. So there is the kind of attraction emotionally and in many other ways to get to the clinical science very quickly. But one cannot deny that there is quite a bit of hard grind in actually understanding some of the basic science elements, which may be less immediately popular. But at some point, it still has to be done. But motivation is very important. There's no question about that. And it is incredible if people are well motivated, how much people can actually absorb very quickly. And we may also actually, just thinking now about your word of stratified medicine, maybe at some point we may also think about a somewhat stratified medical education, more individualized, because a lot of different individuals have very different interests. And if you force everybody to do certain things, it may not actually be. So it occurred to me, listening to you, Stephen, that maybe we should have a stratified medical course. Yeah. This, again, has many complexities and many challenges, but maybe it could be an interesting point. There was one question.
Yeah, sorry. Have introduced that. So the Humanitas University in Milan, for example, run 3 or 4 parallel medical courses to fit different combinations of interests. If you're an engineer and interested in the physical sciences, there's one set of courses to help you. If you're a more social and psychology and all of those things, there's another set, you know, which is quite nice. It is stratified medical education.
And then there's a sort of question which I perceive is a little bit critical by Simon Mahmoud Mahi again, who sort of asked, what about enhancing your vision towards Asian countries, which seems to imply that somehow we are not very interested in cooperation with Asia, which I don't think is the case at all. Maybe we'll start with Stephen. This is a kind of more global rather than European cooperation, I guess.
Yeah, well, the world is a much smaller place than it used to be. And I think collaboration now between scientists and clinicians across the world is almost routine. And I think the point here is also important, is that countries do differ, not only in their genetic makeups to some extent, but they differ in their cultural and social and economic backgrounds. And to make assumptions that one treatment developed for example, a Western culture will be sitting comfortably in an Asian country, you know, is making assumptions too far. And I think you're absolutely correct. We do need to have a much broader, multi-ethnic approach to a lot of what we do in medicine that takes account not only of genetic differences, but the environment and lifestyle differences that different cultures have. And I think this is actually happening now, but it's taken quite a long time to really recognize this. And I'm very pleased that it is happening.
Peter, do you have any comments on this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a big issue, and also maybe in one treatment works very well in European countries and other maybe not very well done in other countries. And this is not only could be because of the genetic background, but also, for example, the eating habits and everything, the nutrition and everything so different globally. So I think we need to go like Stefan's presentations to more into the individual persons, like, and for example, one of the questions was also about the artificial intelligence. And of course, we need to stratify somehow the data to see each person differently and try to best treatment for every individual. Of course, lots of things to do by the time we reach a really personalized medicine in many categories. But I think definitely the scientific individual handling is definitely the future of medicine. And also, if I take the point about the education, which of course, if we think about future, we must think about education, educating translational medicine, how to the implication, how do we need to use our knowledge in daily clinical practice. We need to put it to the undergraduate courses in the medical curriculum. Because currently I don't know whether is there any medical university in which, besides anatomy, pharmacology, translational medicine is one of the subjects which make links between the different disciplinaries.
And specifically on the Asian issue, I would just make the comment that, of course, we can learn a lot also from Asia. And particularly since we discussed COVID-19 a bit here today, it's clear that the Asian countries have, on the whole, done much, much better than the so-called Western countries. And so probably we, again, have to show humility and say, well, there are certain things that they knew actually better than we did. There's an interesting question here towards the end by Christian Yeki down at the bottom, which I think maybe is very much for Stephen actually, about the collecting of data, oncological definitions and decision rules. I wonder if you've seen the question, Stephen, yeah, whether you could comment on that.
So I think one of the ways of getting around this difficulty, because we all recognize it, is to use examples. I mean, there's nothing like having a practical example of a particular disease process that has lent itself to cell and molecular analysis, which has transformed the way the disease is managed. So let me give you an example. In rheumatoid arthritis, when I worked at Charing Cross Hospital in London with Ravinder Maini and Mark Feldman, who discovered anti-TNF treatment for rheumatoid arthritis, when I was working with them initially, there was nothing to treat this terrible disease. And then suddenly, a molecular pathway was defined, the treatment was developed, and overnight we had a dramatic change in the whole way a disease is managed. And that is a wonderful way of illustrating the importance of getting to know the molecular and cellular knowledge behind a set of disease processes, rather than just treating on the basis of, in fact, if I could use the term clinical experience, which is the thing which is most dangerous, because that's where this whole term of arrogance came in, which Oli was talking about a few moments ago, where people believe that they understand more about a particular condition than another person and chooses treatments accordingly. That is totally unacceptable in this modern day and age.
And then I think we have just time for one final question, and I would give the floor there to Peter. This is from Vangsa Ismaya, who talks specifically about how Translational Medicine Project TM could help us specifically in the case of COVID-19. Would you want to say something about that, Peter?
Yeah, I think we can see that the different policy makers have different actions in every country. Some of them make the lockdown decisions very early. Some of them just use the wait and see what will happen. Some of the policymakers felt that they are better than the coronavirus. So I think here scientists have an absolutely key role translating the evidences back to policymakers to make actually right decisions. And I think COVID-19, especially when we later on will analyze what's happened in each country, will make a very, very good example how important is a quick transition of knowledge and scientific evidences back to the decision makers. And I think here there is a big responsibility for scientists as well, because most of us like publishing our discoveries in good papers, and that's it. However, many times this kind of discovery is going up to the shelves and not coming to daily practice. So in this COVID-19 area, I think the communication part of translational medicine develop a lot in every places, and we definitely need for that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have anything to add to that, Stephen?
No, I don't. I think it's wonderful. And I mean, if we only knew enough science to be able to predict what's going to happen next in COVID-19, that would be a great help.
Okay, I think we are actually at the end now. I think we have answered almost all the useful questions that have come in. So it just leaves me the task of, first of all, thanking Peter and Stephen for your contribution today, which is really very, very valuable. Thank you also to all the participants, and particularly to those who sent in very good questions that gave rise to what I think was an interesting discussion. And of course, thank you very much to MDPI for hosting us, and the team at Cardiff Academia Europaea Hub, who have worked hard behind the scenes to make sure that this all works very well. So many, many thanks to all of you. And I think that's then the end of the webinar.
Yes, and maybe just one more information, that I think this webinar will go offline also at the Academia of Europaea's Cardiff Hub webpage, and also in our webpage. So if somebody would like to see the presentations again, I think there will be a chance for that.
Absolutely right, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.